Imagine, demand, and build a world transformed.
Hi everyone, we're going to get started now. Welcome to the first Friday of TWT 2020 and to So the Economy is Tanking, What Does It Mean? My name is Deborah and I've got the pleasure of moderating tonight's session. I'm based in London. I work as a project manager for the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, a German political foundation with offices across the world, and we've just opened one here. I've also been involved with organising the World Transformed since 2016. And so I just want to use my platform very, very briefly to give a massive shout out to the organisers of this year's festival. I'm sure we can all agree that these are quite difficult and unpredictable times. So it's really, really impressive that they have managed to pull off another really great festival, of course, digitally this year. And you've probably heard this before, but TWT needs money. And the festival is free this year, but that's why we really, really need all of you to join the Supporters Network if you can. So please do have a look at theworldtransformed.org/support and see if you can become a supporter. I should also say that we'll be recording tonight's session. So if you'd rather not be recorded, feel free to turn your camera off. Right. So tonight we have the real fortune to be joined by Stevie and Sean from Trademark Belfast for this session. Trademark Belfast is a small but really impressive organisation based in Northern Ireland and doing work all across Ireland and the UK. Their work is based in trade unions and the community. They're focused on political education, anti-sectarian work, and also most recently campaigning for just transition. I was lucky enough to visit them earlier this year, I think in February, and I think we spent 5 hours chatting in a cafe because it was just so interesting and they had so much to say and I learned so much. So I really, really hope that tonight you'll be able to learn from them as well. Before I tell you more about tonight's session, I just want to take 5 minutes to commemorate David Graeber, who I'm sure many of you've heard, died tragically 2 days ago in Venice. David was a comrade, he was an anthropologist, an activist. He was originally from the US. He was one of the founders of the Occupy Wall Street movement and most recently lived in the UK and was very, very active here on the extra parliamentary left, both writing a lot of articles, books, and also just being really, really active in struggle. I didn't know him as well as many others, but I did come across him quite a few times. And from our interactions, I can say that he was an incredibly lovely person, really generous with his time. He was never too good to help a comrade out. And I look back really fondly on sitting in various university rooms in London and just plotting the next protests and the next occupation. And I just wanted to sort of ask Stevie, just really briefly, whether, did you read much of his work? Are there any particular pieces of writing that you can recommend people here give a read?
Yeah, he was. Your heart goes out to his partner and his family and his close comrades and the people that work with him. Such a sudden death. He was one of those rare people nowadays, an activist academic. He certainly didn't hide away in his ivory tower. He was an activist before he was an academic, but he was also a very good academic as well. And his contribution has been massive, particularly for anyone who's interested in understanding, particularly the last 12 years and the global financial crash is kind of his mighty tome, that one on debt. If you haven't got it, get it and make sure it's in your library of books. Fantastic contribution to understanding not just world history, but also the emergence of capitalism and the role of credit and debt and all of that. He teaches so well about how debt fundamental, for instance, to the colonization and imperialism. And he gives a brilliant example in the early chapter of that book. When France invaded Madagascar in 1895, they imposed taxes on the Madagascans to pay for the invasion. And Madagascar is still paying off that debt, 125 years later. Brilliant contribution, and yeah, that book debt will be with us for an awful long time. Unfortunately, he won't.
Thanks, Stevie, and yeah, solidarity to David's family and all his loved ones, and everyone else. Make sure to read and share his work to continue his legacy. All right. So tonight's session, we work like this. I'm going to ask Stevie and Sean some big questions, and they're going to take us on a journey through a presentation for around 40 minutes, helping us understand this unfolding crisis, its impact on the economy, and how it relates to the ongoing crisis of capitalism. While they talk, please post any questions you have in the chat, and I'll do my best to collect them and ask them follow-ups. You're lucky that I think I was specifically chosen to chair the session because I basically know nothing about the economy. So I will try my best to make it really accessible and ask good follow-up questions. And then for the last part of the session, there's going to be some space for discussion and questions. We're going to try and have a bit of a discussion with 100 people, because that's how many of you there are. So hopefully that'll be really interesting. Just, you know, another sort of caveat, we want everyone to feel welcome in these spaces. We want everyone's voice to be heard. So please bear that in mind when engaging with the chat. Don't use inappropriate, rude or unkind language. Don't spam. And anyone who does violate those principles will be prevented from posting again and, if necessary, removed. All right. So I just have a question for you. Who of you have been to TWT in Liverpool before? Can you put up your hand? I'm going to change my view. If you've been to TWT in Liverpool before, put up your hand. Right, quite a few of you. So I think we all have very fond memories of the festival there in 2016 and 2018. And I'm sure you all will remember the Blackie, the amazing historic community and arts venue in Liverpool. I want you to imagine now that you've just spent 2 hours queuing in the rain. It's a Friday night. It's not nice outside. You've been queuing in the rain, and like just now, a lovely TWT volunteer in one of those black t-shirts has let you in. You walked through the beautiful entrance, up those stairs. You know, maybe if you're quick enough, you went to the bar, got yourself a drink, and now you're going to sit down. You're surrounded by 100 comrades in that really lovely venue, and you're waiting with expectation and getting excited. And then on stage come Stevie and Sean. And so Stevie and Sean, let's get started. Can you tell me a bit about yourselves and why you think political economy education is so important?
Yes, we certainly will. Thanks very much for the invitation, and thanks so many people for turning up to listen to our ramblings and rantings on a late Friday afternoon. If you don't have a drink in front of you, I can assure you I do. It is the weekend after all. I want to share a screen with you and flash up some images as I talk, and the benefit of that is you don't have to look at me or Sean for most of the evening. We were asked to talk to you about, you know, so the economy is tanking and why, and what the prospects are for the next couple of years. And Deborah mentioned there that she wasn't an economist, and I'd like to add my kind of name to that list of people that aren't economists. Sometimes I think they're the last people we should be listening to, particularly as to the man and woman in 2008, the entire economics profession failed to predict the largest crash in the world economy in 70 years. And that's part of the problem, is that we hand over far too much time and respect to a profession that is rooted in a particular school of economics. What part of our role over the last number of years is to try, of course, to change that. In terms of who we are, Trademark is the anti-sectarian unit of the Irish Labour movement. And so we're the last people you should really come to listen to about economics. Our core role since our inception in the 1990s has been the peace process. Our core work is really workplace intervention to deal with conflicts of a serious sectarian nature. We work with, our office is based on the Falls Shankill interface in Belfast, of course, which is where all trade unionists should be. More than welcome to pop in anytime you're in Belfast. Feel free, just give us a wee ring. That's the longest and biggest interface in Belfast. It's a mile long and separates the British Unionist Shankill from the Irish Nationalist Republican Falls. And we continue to do that work. We work with paramilitaries on a weekly basis and the organisations that represent them, both loyalist and Republican. And that work we continue to do, unfortunately, but it is required. But all that kind of changed in terms of our focus in 2008 with the global financial crash. And we were approached by a number of people in Belfast initially who basically said, like, what the fuck just happened? Can you explain to us what's happening in the world economy? And we said, no, go back to your trade unions, go back to your branch, go back to your education officers. They'll tell you what happened, because that's the place you come from. And some of them did that, and they came back to us and said, no, the union doesn't provide that kind of education. So we and as trade unionists ourselves, we're both members of Unites and have been for a long time, we kind of did a quick survey of trade union education. It was shocking to us to find that in too many places, I'm not going to accuse everybody of not doing it, but in too many parts of the labour movement, in Britain and Ireland, there was no teaching or courses on economics and political economy. I mean, it was kind of shocking, really. So we did a survey, and just to give you one example of the problem with trade union education, subtly shifted since, but to be honest with you, not too much. Vince Cable backs union learning. I bet he does. The skills agenda is fundamental to achieving economic growth. Trade unions have a powerful model in learning and reaching out to businesses and giving individuals a chance. That is not the language of a movement set up to create, working class power. That could come out of an FE college. Trade unions are not about individuals improving their ability to sell themselves into the marketplace. They're not places where you should come to build your CV, and yet that's what we've become. And there's all sorts of reasons why that was the case over the previous 30 years. And that was one of the reasons we found why, when members were desperate for someone to explain to them what had happened in 2008 and since, there was a huge lack of capacity in the labour movement in both Britain and Ireland to do that. And so as a small tin pot organisation in Belfast, we kind of found ourselves in a position of, we put on classes in Belfast on a weekend. They were packed weekend after weekend. And then we began to teach all across Ireland. And then we got invitations from Unite, our own union, to do the same in Britain. And I would still argue that there's too many parts of the labour movement that aren't teaching political economy and political education. And one of the reasons why was because too many people on the left had bought into that notion, that there was no alternative to this system, actually, so there's no point really talking about it. There's no point trying to build utopias now or talk about alternative economics or alternative economies. We're just going to tinker with this system that's destroying the planet, that's destroying the kind of life-saving elements of the planet. So we thought that we needed to delve a little bit deeper into that, to talk about alternatives and to talk about socialist economics, which is a thing. It exists. You can read books on it, but none of it was available, we felt, in the trade union movement. And it came back to this idea that David Harvey, you'll know David Harvey, the Mancunian in America, he kind of articulated it really well. He said that after the Chilean coup, strong processes of neoliberalism have transformed the world, transformed us to the point where all of us are neoliberals, whether we like it or not. And to me, that rings true in so many places, that people who are of the left don't think like leftists anymore. They don't think like socialists. They actually think like neoliberals. It's as if the neoliberal thinking and the myths of neoliberals and that kind of embedded discourse has changed the way we think. And we have to do two things. One is deconstruct that discourse and the kind of brainwashing almost has taken place, and rebuild socialist economics in its place. And that's what we've been trying to do. And that colonization of the left entered all of the political parties on the left as well. I remember when he said that the Labour Party is intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. Those are words that should never come out of the mouth of a party that represents the working class. And Thatcher knew it really, really well. And she said it, and it worked. She said economics are the method, but she said what we really have to do is change the way people think and feel about the economy. And if there's a reason why there are too many millions of working class Tories, it's because the last 30 years that they've spent creating that. And I mean, that's one of the things to remember. They've been at this for decades, and we're only starting now really and TWT and others, in quite a small way, I have to admit, trying to turn back 40 years of indoctrination by neoliberalism into how we think about the economy and the kinds of neoliberal discourses which replaced our own common sense. And so if we're about anything, it's replacing kind of right-wing hegemony with left-wing hegemony, so that when people think about the economy, they think about the economy as socialists, not as capitalists. Another problem we have is that the academy has also been colonized by right-wing thinking, particularly by a particular school of economics, neoclassical economics, which kind of doesn't teach anymore. There have been demonstrations, I know, in Liverpool and Manchester over the last 10 years about how economics is taught in university, and people were angry that all they were getting was neoclassical economics, and what they were being taught was how to manage capitalism. They weren't being taught about Keynesianism or Marxism or substantivism or feminist economics or green economics. It was just neoclassical economics, which was kind of overly focused on microeconomics, theory of firms, the theory of markets, to the point where in Queen's University in Belfast, kind of where we are our hinterlands, they changed the School of Economics to the School of Management. And that told you everything you need to know about how the ideological shift takes place in academia. And there is an image of a neoclassical economist in 2008, looking in the wrong direction and asking the wrong questions. You can, maybe another better image is imagine yourself standing on a beach looking inland, and you're looking inland at a forest on a summer's day with the birds twittering in the trees and a nice gentle breeze, and the economy says, look at the economy, it's doing fantastically, and all the fundamentals of the economy are sound. Meanwhile, behind him or her, out to sea, is a massive fucking tidal wave coming in. And in 2008, that tidal wave was one of finance, of debt, of banking, and of course, all the mathematical modelling done by these neoclassical economists ignore debt and finance and shadow banking. So they couldn't predict the crash because they weren't looking at it. And I'd argue that kind of thinking has also colonized too much of the left, including the labour movement. Samir Amin says it best, I think. Economics is not the theory of the real world or of really existing capitalism, but of an imaginary capitalism. There's not even a rigorous theory of the latter. It is a parascience, closer in fact to sorcery than to the natural science. So the first thing we do is stop listening to economists, particularly ones who are in the press every day, on the TV every day. Don't watch BBC News when an economist comes on, because they're usually from a finance house from the City of London anyway. Our job is to, I suppose, start reconnecting ourselves to understanding how the economy works, as we did for decades, for 150 years. A friend of mine told me last week, wrote a brilliant article. He said there were 300 miners' libraries in Wales in the 1930s. There were worker discussions. There were miners coming off shifts reading Capital. We've lost all of that. We've lost all of those institutions. So we have so much to rebuild, and we're starting at a really low ebb. Mainstream economics, which dominates everywhere, press, academia, political parties, is increasingly divorced from reality, and we're going to go on to that in the next session. But it does provide a convenient cover to make capitalism look like a natural system. So capitalism, what it is, what it means, where it comes from, where it's going, it becomes invisible. So you can't even talk about it. I remember 15 years ago where you'd have been chased out of a trade union office if you mentioned the words capitalism and class. You couldn't even mention the words. It's a deliberate result of the need to avoid considering the reality of the economy and where it's taking us in terms of climate breakdown and indeed civilizational collapse by the end of the century. Mainstream economics is it's misdirection at best, it's propaganda at worst. I'll give you one example. I tried to find the figures for the UK, but I couldn't. I've only got figures for Ireland and America. But one of the things capitalism promises us is competition brings great results. Competition reduces the price of consumer goods, and that's what we love. We love shopping. Our identity is more as consumers now than workers. And so you can go into a pound shop, with 20 quid in your hand and come out with 2 bags of crap that'll be on a landfill site within a month. But you've consumed and you've been part of that system and you've enjoyed it. And those kind of lists there of clothing and phones and software and toys and household furnishings, the price of many of those things has actually come down quite dramatically over the last 15 to 20 years. And capitalism turns around and says, there you go, we provided for you. Our competition made these things that you want to consume cheaper. And those things we kind of want, but you could ask yourself, do we need them? Do we need those things? You could probably live without some of them. And then you ask yourself another question, what do we actually need to live? And ask that question of the people around you in your workplaces, in your homes. What do you need to live, not what you want? And we confuse want and need too much in this society. Well, what I need to live, I need a house. I need a job that pays me well. I want healthcare for my children. I wouldn't mind a pension. That wouldn't be a bad idea. I would like free education for my kids. And then you ask yourself, well, what's the cost of those things? What's happening to those things? And those things are being handed over to private interests. They're being privatized. And what's the cost of them? The cost of them is rocketing. The things we need, and we've taken our eye off the ball. We've been seduced by consumer capitalism. Meanwhile, the things we actually need to live, we can't afford and are increasingly beyond too many people. But there is a chink in the armour, and there was a chink in the armour in 2008, and that was the collapse of capitalism. That was a collapse of the financial system. At one point, something like 60% of world GDP was being coordinated to prop up the financial system. And they say there's no money. They say there's no resources for a just transition, for a green deal. 60% of the world economy at one point was being used to prop up a collapsed financial system. And that was the front page of, not the front page, of the business section of the FT. And it actually asked the question, the future of capitalism. The very fact they had the capitalism, that C word in the FT was a shock. It's always the economy. They were worried. They were shitting themselves in 2009, by the way. The credit crunch has destroyed faith in free market ideology, but what should replace it? Now, you couldn't even ask that question in a trade union education room 15 years ago, but the FT was asking it because they were concerned. And so there was an opportunity 12 years ago for the left to organise around the fact that the emperor wasn't just naked, the emperor was bollock naked. I mean, the emperor's new clothes, you could point at the inadequacies of this system, and we missed that opportunity massively. We have another opportunity in the midst of the COVID crisis to point at the same contradictions of this system and why this system is not the system that's going to take us through climate breakdown to some sort of sustainable future. The question is whether we're going to miss another opportunity. Are we in a better place now than we were in 2008? Maybe get a question about that later. And when you look through that period of 2010, that wee opportunity opened up, and it's still kind of there, I think. The very fact that Karl Marx and Das Kapital was being mentioned in the public press, even the BBC had it, Marx popular amidst the credit crunch. 150 years of Das Kapital, how relevant is Karl Marx today? The Guardian even had the words Karl and Marx together in a headline. Why the ideas of Karl Marx are more relevant than ever in the 21st century. Spectator, face it, Marx was partly right. Well, that's nice at least. That's Rowan Williams. He'd know a lot about Marxism. But the very fact that they were kind of tackling these questions because the system that they supported was crumbling around them. In America, not as on the ball, but at least they're asking the question, who was Karl Marx? Who was this geezer? But my favourite is Fox News. Millennials agree with Marx more than the Bible. So there's hope yet, you know? And so that's the questions we asked ourselves over these last few years, and we've been working with others in the labour movement, particularly, and in NGOs. Like, what's our analysis of what caused that crisis, and how do we teach it to people? Also, what's our transformative vision of the future? There's no point just critiquing the system. It's easy to do, particularly at the moment, because it's falling apart. Is there a road to a better future, and what it might entail? How do we communicate it? There's a total absence, almost, apart from TWT and another couple of fine examples, there's a total absence of activist political education in working class communities in Britain and Ireland. It just doesn't exist. It might exist in pockets. I don't even think it exists in pockets, actually. It's just not something that we have anymore. And the only way you're going to build left hegemony and build a social movement where left-wing thinking becomes people's common sense understandings of the world is by being physically present in working class communities, talking and teaching about economics and running and assisting with campaigns. So our job, the job of all of us on the left, is to democratize economic knowledge. It's not the only job, it's just one of the building blocks of the things that we need to do. We need to give people the language and the analysis and create a cadre of activists who know and can talk and can go into Grenfell, into the Red Wall, and be in community centres and talk about economics, and more importantly, get people to understand what it is we're saying. Aditya Chakraborty did a great article a couple of years ago when he kind of interviewed a load of people who were trying to do that up in Manchester, and there was Momentum ones involved, there was Unite ones involved, there's Labour Party activists involved, and they were teaching economics to, when I say ordinary people, it's a bit of an insulting term, but you know what I mean. And when you teach economics to people, it changes their view of the world. It's that simple, and it is that simple. And so that's our project, that's our role, is political economy for the masses. How do we do that? How do we rebuild those institutions that used to do it when they've all been wiped away? The Labour movement has a role in this, the Labour Party has a role in this, and activists across Britain and Ireland have roles in this. We were lucky to be able to pilot a kind of mass political education program in Ireland. 5 years ago, we had the beginnings of the Right to Water social movement, the biggest social movement in Ireland since partition 100 years ago. Hundreds of thousands of people in 8 massive marches. It would have been equivalent to like the Iraq War March, the anti-Iraq War March in London, like it would have been equivalent to like 2 million people marching on London. And it was about preventing, of course, the installation of water charges, meters charges, and the eventual privatisation of the system. We got the chance to work with organic working class activists across the length and breadth of Ireland in pubs, in sports halls, in church halls, for a couple of years on end, and we were everywhere across the country, working with people that weren't left-wing, that weren't involved in left-wing parties, that were kind of quite antipathetic towards the trade union movement, and actually a little bit on the right, most of them. They just didn't want to pay more taxes. That was the kind of the resistance where it was coming from. And we had a huge impact on that, and the political education work we did had a huge impact in giving that movement a kind of ideological framework to hang their resistance to water charges on, and give it a kind of left-wing steer. And that's kind of one of the examples of how we can do this. So that's kind of how we came to political education. We're still involved in it, and we're involved more with Unite in Britain, helping Unite develop their political economy classes with specialist schools in Ruskin and other parts, and the Unite Political School up in Durham. But I would argue again, not enough of it goes on, and it's a real problem. And the more we ignore the absence of political education and political economy, the worse things are going to get. It's something that always falls off the agenda at every political party or political movement meeting I've been at, is education. And there we're talking and celebrating the work of David Graeber, a man that knew it's both, it's education and activism together. Right, that's my introduction. I'll stop that now. Deborah, is that all right?
Yeah, that was great. Thanks so much. And yeah, I cannot recommend enough sort of people checking out what Trademark do. I won't sort of stay on this section for too long because I know we've got like the main part to come. I just wanted to ask you one question that came up in the chat from Jessica, which a few people said they were sort of interested in hearing about. So Jessica was wondering, how do we have open discussions with friends on this topic if those friends still have the view that the economy as it is now is a system that works for everyone? So basically, how do you open up these conversations at Christmas or in
yeah. And not fall out with all of your family, you mean? And your friends. Yeah, I'm not too sure. I've fallen out with all my family and all my friends. It's a tough one, but the first thing you do, of course, is become used to arguing. It's easy for us because we're at it all of the time. It's like a full-time job. So the more you argue with people, the more you discuss these issues with people, the better you become at it. That's one of the skills you develop. But it's a tough one. I come from a background here in Northern Ireland where my first 10 years in this kind of game was talking to people about prejudice and discrimination and racism and sectarianism. And that's not easy to do here either. So maybe us going through that made it easier for us to talk about something like economics, which seems so easy. But you're going to fall out with your friends and you're going to fall out with your family. That's really it. There's no other way unless, it's going to happen unless you can win them over. I don't know if you can come in on that one, Sean, but the more you do it, the better you get at it, And the more articulate you are, the more knowledgeable you are. There's no shortcut for education. There's no shortcut for knowledge. That means reading. It means studying. We used to have a proud tradition in the working class, didn't we, of self-education, of making sure that we were armed against that system by educating ourselves. And we've kind of lost that a bit, I think.
Yeah, I suppose it's just to add to what Stevie says. It's not easy, and you will fall out with people. But the point that Stevie makes about like trade unionists, shop stewards used to be pillars of their company. They weren't just workplace reps, but they were experts in housing and healthcare and the economy and so on. And they were able to sit down with their friends and family, sit down with their colleagues in the workplace, and thrash out those conversations. And you find that a lot of the time you will win people over. If you sit over a pint, you approach it from an empathetic sort of perspective, and just thrash out the conversation, you will win people over. And sometimes you will get people to come around to the position that is what we need is the guillotine and pitchforks and all that sort of stuff. Like
my local boozer is I live in rural Northern Ireland in County Down. The local boozer is quite Republican, quite Catholic, very working class. They're all farmers. It's practically a Soviet at this stage, So it's possible.
Are you crediting yourself for that?
Absolutely, 100%.
Right. All right, I'll move us on to part two. So I think we're moving to Sean. Sean, can you tell us a little bit about the economy, how it was pre-COVID, and what impact you think coronavirus has had?
Okay, yeah.
2 seconds.
Flash it up. I suppose I should just start by saying that one of the things that happened around the time of the financial crisis is that you had so-called experts, mainstream commentators, economists, all the people you see on the TV now, trundled out to tell us that this crisis was unpredictable, it was unpredicted, it was a once in a generation crisis, and then later that it was a crisis of public spending. I see someone has raised that in the chat. Now, there was some resistance to this. Stevie's pointed out that, there was a brief questioning of the system and the narratives that we were being given, but ultimately that is the narrative that won out. And unfortunately, even the Labour Party came round to that position, that there was too much public spending and that's what needed to suffer. This time around, it should be easier, to point to the inadequacies and the contradictions of the system, especially if that generation of people who have been at the sharp end of now 2 major economic collapses, not just one, but 2. But there is a danger, and I think we can see this happening already, where the same experts and commentators are being trundled out, and they will be trundled out once the public health aspect of this pandemic recedes. And the sort of line we're going to get is, again, this was unpredicted, it was unpredictable. It was an external shock to the system that caused the economic collapse, and otherwise things would have been fine. And I think, to go back to Stevie's point, we need to start countering that narrative right now. We need to start deconstructing it, and we need to start by understanding that the global economy was already in the early stages of a downturn before the pandemic even hit. So this screen here, this is the IMF in October 2019. Now this is well before the pandemic hit, and this IMF basically saying, look lads, we're a wee bit too optimistic in our last forecasts. We've had to revise them down again. And what we're going to see now is the slowest pace in global growth since the financial crisis. Stevie. This was inevitable. Now, the problem with this is that this was inevitable, that it wasn't the first time this had happened. And Stevie talks about so-called experts and institutions that get deference that they don't deserve. And the IMF is one of those institutions. The problem is that the IMF, since around 2010, have been repeatedly getting things wrong, repeatedly. They kept having to revise down the forecast because they were always too optimistic. They were saying things are going to get better, brighter days are just around the corner. And the next year they'll have to say, no, actually they won't. Things are going to get worse before they get better. And they did that consistently over the period of 10 years. So that article there, that was the deputy director of the IMF, basically saying that the IMF doesn't know what it's doing. The former deputy director, and it's going through a Groundhog Day. And the reason that it's going through that is because it's failing to understand the underlying weaknesses of the global economy. And those are low private sector investment, a massive build-up of debt. We'll look at that in a second. Financial instability, and the lasting impact of austerity, which had really strangled off any hope of a recovery in Britain and the Eurozone. So the Eurozone was really stagnating since 2008, 2010, and people say that Germany was the exception. Germany's widely regarded as the driver of economic growth in the Eurozone. But even in Germany, things have started to go into trouble. Since around 2018, articles started appearing saying, I think the German car industry, German manufacturing is actually in recession, and there's plenty of evidence to point to that. And basically the reason why is that no one was buying German cars anymore, and the German economy was in trouble. So if you want to understand why the European Union was so keen to get the Mercosur trade agreement in place with Brazil, is because Germany needed to sell more cars, otherwise it was going to be in trouble. And this is well prior to the pandemic. Growth in China had also slowed down. Part of the reason for this was an escalating trade war with the US. That was only one factor. Another part of the reason was that China was running out of room for public investment. You see the massive investment stimulus program that China introduced in terms of roads and rail and infrastructure and so on, and it was running out of room for that investment. Chinese consumers are also spending a lot less. And when you're talking about Chinese growth slowing down, you're talking about a slowdown from about 8% to 3% annual growth, and that's not a massive problem for China. But it is a problem for all the economies that are dependent on China for exports. So you look at Australia, for example, that gives China a lot of its steel. The demand's not there. That's enough to push Australia into recession, and that's what was happening. Now, if you've been reading the Bloomberg or the Financial Times or the Economist, and you should be, we would advocate that left-wing activists, socialist activists, should be reading the Financial Times and these other papers of the capitalist press. You would pick up on another sign that the economy was headed towards a major collapse, and that's the issue of private sector debt. So corporate debt alone, and by corporate debt I mean that's companies actually producing and selling things, doubled to 74 trillion in the decade since the financial crash. And that, to put that into perspective, that's the entire equivalent of global GDP. So what this says is that any recovery, and it was a weak recovery experienced by the private sector, it wasn't real. It was totally fictitious. It was built in sand, and it was always prone to collapse. Steve Keen, who's a left-wing economist, some of you might be aware of him, he predicted the last crash. He predicted this one. He said that corporate debt is the elephant in the living room of economics. So it's the thing that threatens to upend everything. It's the thing that threatens to bring down the entire global economy, but it's also the thing that mainstream economists refuse to talk about, and we need to be talking about it. And one of the features of this sort of exploding corporate debt bubble is the rise of so-called zombie firms. Don't know how many people have heard of zombie firms, but what these are basically firms that are dependent on the high levels of debt. They're dependent on the low interest rates and bailouts. If interest rates go up, they're fucked, basically. They can only service the debt, so they're just borrowing and servicing the debt. They're not paying off any of the debt itself. And prior to COVID, 8% of all UK firms and 10% of all OECD firms were zombie companies. You know, there are companies that were just borrowing to survive. They weren't making any profit. They weren't investing. They weren't making any progress. They're just borrowing to survive. That was pre-COVID. You know, imagine what the percentage is now. And the institutions lending the money, because we're just piling shit upon shit upon shit. The institutions lending the money to the business sector were also in trouble. So you had a lot of banks who hadn't even properly recovered from the last financial crisis. Debt in the financial sector was actually much higher than it was in 2008. And McKinsey, the big global consultancy firm, was saying in October that half of the world's banks were too weak to survive an economic crash. So in which case, what you would see is a repeat of the last crisis on a much larger scale. Takeovers, bailouts, the too big to fail sort of problem. And that was what was coming down the line and could be coming down the line. And to make matters worse, it's not just the banks that are in trouble. We have a massive shadow banking sector to contend with. So the shadow banking sector, for those of you who might not know, is totally unregulated institutions that basically act as loan sharks for businesses, speculators, and they're even lending the banks themselves. The banks can't get credit from other banks, so they go to the shadow banking system. The shadow banking sector is 75% bigger than it was at the time of the last financial crisis. It's just massive. Like, estimates are saying that the shadow banking sector accounts for up to about half of the entire banking sector. So that's half the entire banking sector is totally unregulated and just behaving like loan sharks. And if it were to collapse, and it will, you can imagine the trouble that's going to cause. So the result of that, if you looked around you, if you read the right papers, if you read the right publications, if you looked in the right places, you saw that all around us people were predicting another financial crash, another economic downturn. Countdown to financial crash. Banks predict meltdown 2020. Next financial crash has already begun, and it'll be worse than the 2008 crash, economists were. Next global financial crash will strike into 2020, warns investment bank JP Morgan. So JP Morgan are even warning about it. There's no end to these headlines. And then, so we had all these predictions, we had all this massive shit heap, and then the COVID pandemic hit. And of course, the initial reaction was the Wall Street stock market crashed, along with the stock markets across the advanced capitalist world. The stock markets then start to rally. And why is that? Because, and we're going to go into this. It actually reached on the same day that the announcement was made that the economy had been hit much worse than people initially expected by COVID. The US stock market hit an all-time high. So like the economic reality on the ground was totally divorced from what was happening in the stock market. And the reason for that was the the nature and the scale of government interventions, of the interventions of central banks. They intervened in a scale that has totally eclipsed their interventions at the time of the financial crash. So the ECB, for example, started buying up government and bank and corporate sector debt. Initially their program was something like 700 billion. They've since doubled that and extended it to June 2021, and they'll probably extend it more because it's not going to resolve the contradictions at the heart of the Eurozone. The Fed did the same thing. They said we're going to purchase an unlimited amount of government debt, and we're going to keep buying, and as long as the stock market needs it. They previously set a limit of 700 billion. They said, nah, scrap that. We'll just go for it here. And the Bank of England, closer to home, the Bank of England's quantitative easing program, some people might remember it introduced quantitative easing program at the time of the last crash. That's basically doubled in response to COVID. So you have the Bank of England purchasing government bonds, buying up government debt, and in order that the government can direct that, and you have people starting to ask the question, well, and there's people say that the veil has been lifted, and the narrative of austerity and the arguments for austerity were a total myth. And you had the argument that the Bank of England couldn't finance the government, that central banks can't finance governments, and now you have people responding and saying, well, actually, I think that's what's going on. The Bank of England is channeling money directly into the government coffers.
And one of the things to remember about that is that Britain's quantitative easing program and Britain's response to the COVID crisis, as Sean said, is to not just to buy back its own debt from bond markets. Now think of that one, it's really important. It buys back its own debt, so the government's buying billions of pounds of its own debt back off the bond markets, and then it's putting that debt on the national debt. Now ask yourself this question: if you owed yourself a tenner, what would you say to yourself? You'd say, don't worry about it, that's dead. You'd cancel it. The government could cancel the debt it's buying from these bond markets, but what it's doing is lumping it onto national debt, giving a false impression of the amount of money Britain's in debt to, so that legitimizes austerity 2.0. I mean, Japan, for instance, is the most indebted government in the world, 250% debt to GDP ratio. Japan owns half its own debt. It owns 120% of Japan's debt is owned by Japan itself, by its own central bank. So really, that's no debt at all. It's just a fiction. And it's a fiction. It's amazing how big this lie is. I mean, the bigger the lie, perhaps, the easier it is to tell. Japan, debt to GDP ratio is only about 120%. It's not 250% because it owes that money to itself. And the bank and those governments could cancel that debt. It's choosing not to. Britain is now doing exactly the same thing. It's running up a debt at its own bank, but it's pretending that it's borrowing that money from private investors when it's not. The reason why it's and every now and again it slips out in the FT that this is actually what they're doing. But then economists come on TV and tell a different story, which is in fact a lie, which is that this money is being borrowed when most of it isn't being borrowed at all. But borrowing allows you to go back to that household budget myth of Margaret Thatcher that countries have to behave like households when they don't, they never have had. I mean, if you read the David Graeber book, it's brilliant on that stuff. In January 2015, the Bank of England paid off the debt to the slavers following the abolition of slavery. And in the same month of January 2015, it paid off debt it borrowed from the Bank of England to deal with the Irish famine. The lies are so big and they're being promoted and retold and embedded in public discourse. So when you do go to your mate and talk about the economy, those kind of embedded narratives become their common sense understanding of the world. And it's tough for us, but we have to do is deconstruct those arguments. Sorry, Sean, carry on.
I think that's us. Well, all I could say is just to add to that, I mean, we wouldn't even need to cancel the debt. The Bank of England could keep up the pretense that it's going to call the debt in, and it's never going to call the debt in. But it could keep up the pretense forever, and say no more about it.
I think that's where we were supposed to stop, isn't it, Sean?
Aye. Well, yeah. It's a natural break, anyway.
It's not prepared for the break.
Sorry.
No, all good.
We're just making up as we go along.
I was still trying to understand what you just explained about the debt. I guess what doesn't go into my head is, how are they allowed to lie about that? Like, how do they get away with that? Stevie?
I mean, it's a establishment media, isn't it? I mean, if you Google, just tonight when we finish this, Google Bank of England's overt monetary financing, or direct monetary finance, DMF, Bank of England, and it will take you to those Financial Times articles which admit quite openly that the Bank of England is financing government spending. Now, I don't want to get into a whole debate about modern monetary theory. That's a debate for another day about how government finances actually work versus how we're told they work. But there's absolutely no doubt that one of the biggest myths of neoliberalism is that governments have to, pretend they're a household and balance the books. And that deficit fetishism, which the Labour Party bought into incorrectly, in my opinion, they bought into it probably because it's a hard sell. Because as you said, Deborah, it's hard to explain to people after 30 or 40 years of these narratives being sold to us all of the time that we have to be. It's counterintuitive for most people. And if you say to someone that the government has to balance its books, people get that. It's a nice story. It makes sense because they have to balance their books at home. But, I mean, countries are not households. Countries are always in debt. States are always in debt and have been for 300 years since the invention of banking. It's a huge myth, but it's one that we have to deconstruct. And the only way we get to do that as activists is through good political education and political economy education. There's no shortcut to that stuff. But, yeah, most of the government debt that's running at the moment isn't debt at all. It's a fiction. But it's really useful when you're trying to sell austerity 2.0, isn't it? We haven't got any money. We can't afford it. But they can, and there is plenty of it.
So talking of potentially not being able to afford something, but then doing it anyway, Linda was wondering earlier whether the state is going to bail out the banks again, and whether that sort of dynamic of 2008, whether that's something that would happen again in this crisis. And maybe just one more question that came up in the chat, and they're quite separate. Nick was wondering what's going to happen with the stock market given the real economy is tanking. Like, how do the two sort of relate to each other in this crisis?
I'll answer that question in the next little bit, maybe, because we've got a bit on that where I can directly answer that question for you if that helps.
Great.
Yeah. And I suppose the next section might point to the answer to the first question as well. I mean, all of the interventions by the Bank of England and the British government in particular have been directed towards, propping up the banks, the financial sector, and the stock market. All of the interventions, Stevie's going to show how, but all of their interventions so far have been directed towards that. Now, so far, I haven't seen any indication that the British government is interested in bailing out the banks as such. I think they're basically saying that they can fight it out with their debtors. But things get a lot worse, and I suspect they are going to get a lot worse. You could see that sort of intervention. I don't think that quantitative easing program that has been introduced in Britain, in Europe, and in the US is over. I think we're going to see a massive expansion of it, and it could be extended for a long time, as long as this sort of crisis lasts.
All right, I'll take it on from there. I'll try and answer that question that come up when I saw that other question there about what happens when the stock market becomes so separate from the real economy and from the productive economy. And of course, that's what's kind of happening. I suppose the idea is when does that happen, and can we predict it? One of the questions we wanted to kind of ask is, where's the money that QE is producing? There's two questions there. One is, if the government's buying back loads of debt from the bond markets, where does it get that money in the first place? There's a little secret question for you to go and answer for yourselves. If the government's buying back billions of pounds of QE, where's that money coming from? Well, it's just creating it at the Bank of England. And it's just getting into those markets and buying money. There's always money when a government in charge of its own sovereign currency wants to create it. What's happening to the money that's being pumped into the stock market is the question. Where's that money going? Is it trickling down even to the real economy? What are they doing? What are these finance houses and big companies doing with the money? And hold on, let me just.
Stevie, do you mind just talking a bit slower?
No, of course I will. I'll try, but I'll speed up inevitably. One of the things that's been happening within the capitalist system for the last 20 years is a form of stock market price or share price manipulation called share buybacks, or in America, stock buybacks. Up until the 1980s, they were illegal. Now they take up, they're a kind of mainstream response of large companies. So what is a kind of a share buyback is the question, and what does it mean to the economy? And we don't have the figures yet for the money that's being pumped into the stock market, but we can kind of take a guess at what was happening before COVID, pre-COVID, as to what's probably happening now. I mean, around the world, there are about 60 stock exchanges around the planet, and they're worth about $70 trillion of value at the moment. And people have been talking about Jeff Bezos and how he's doing really well at the moment, how he's worth 190 billion, and that his personal wealth has gone up by 74 billion during COVID and so on. But the reality is most of that wealth isn't real. I mean, as Marx tells us, it's fictitious capital. It's only real when they realize the dividend at the end of the year. Until that point, and the expansion of the share price, if you like, is dependent on the idea that at the end of the year there's going to be production and profit to pay the value of that share. The reality is that the bulk of the growth of Amazon isn't actually necessarily based on actual productivity. It's based on people's perceptions and feelings about how well Amazon is doing, and that's driving up the share price. Fictitious capital, like owning a share is a fictitious capital. Owning debt is fictitious capital. It only becomes real when it's paid out. I mean, fictitious capital it represents a claim over wealth that's yet to be produced. And that's the link between the stock market and the actual economy, that productive bit that we work in factories across the world. That has to produce profits in order to realize the fictitious nature of the share price, The expansion of the share price, therefore, the expansion of the stock market, the bubble that's growing, is implies a growing kind of preemption of future production and future profits. So it's a huge risk. It's a huge bubble. It's a massive pyramid scheme. And much of that growth in share prices is people borrowing from the shadow banking system to invest in those shares. So it's like extended chains of indebtedness across the globe. It's a massive pyramid scheme that can only end up collapsing. And that's only, debts, bonds, gilts, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations. There's a dizzying array of new financial products, but all they are really is debt upon debt upon debt, people borrowing to speculate. And share buybacks is one of those. So a company goes into the stock market and buys back billions of pounds worth of shares of its own company. Now, what's the result of that? Well, it synthetically, artificially pushes the share price higher because there's less of those shares being publicly traded, therefore they become worth more. It benefits top executives, of course. They love it. Why? Because most of their salaries or income or packages are tied into the share price. So if the share price artificially rises because they're buying shares back and leaving less in the market, their wealth goes up. And it makes the company look more successful artificially. And if that isn't bad enough, most of the companies who are buying back their own shares from the stock market to artificially raise its price are borrowing the money to do that, therefore further indebting the company while speculating on their own share price. You can see why this used to be illegal, because it is, of course, stock market manipulation. This is what capitalism is up to at the moment. And this is where that QE money is going. The billions, the trillions that banks across the world are creating is going into finance capitalist speculation, not going into the productive economy. And share buybacks make no contribution to the productive kind of capabilities of the company at all. And if there's any rise in the share prices in that 12-month period, dividends are paid out to shareholders. So they make money based on it. The result, of course, is increased financial instability and the kind of locking in of future crises in that system. And that's one thing. So that's a share buyback. The proportion of buybacks being funded by bonds was 30% pre-COVID. They're now getting QE money for free. So they're using QE money now to just buy back their own shares and falsely raising the stock market price. Even the IMF, that shite organisation that Sean referred to that constantly gets things wrong, they predicted last year that debt-funded payouts, these debt-funded buybacks of shares, are extreme financial risk-taking. And of the top 500 companies in the Standard & Poor's 500, 52% of their net income is engaged in stock market manipulation. So when we look at the stock market, and when you're sitting at the end of the BBC News before the weather comes on and they show the Dow Jones Index and the FT, they're giving a false impression of the world economy. None of it's real. It's not true. But it is sucking wealth out through financialization, through our indebtedness, in to pay those profits and dividends to the point where it collapses. To give you an example of how this is happening in the middle of COVID, this is the only one I could find from last week, August 19th. Intel, the big tech company, engaged in a $10 billion share buyback of its own last week on the 19th, and it borrowed the 10 billion to buy its own shares in the hope that that would give its share price a bump and were therefore attracting investors to buy its shares and then bump the company up. What happened? The next day, in the same paper, buyback isn't a strong enough signal. It didn't work for them. The share price didn't increase enough. The company will end the quarter with net debt topping 20 billion. So the stock market is increasingly divorced from the real productive economy. It's massive speculation. It will collapse. And all of the banks that are funding that speculation will also collapse. And to answer the person's question, will the states bail out the banks? What do you think? We did it once, we'll do it again. And we do it almost every time, as we're doing with QE, without any conditionality. We're just giving them the money. Here, lads, have the next 20, 30 years of what our investment would have been in schools and hospitals and the real productive economy. The other thing, one other example of what's going on with the QE money and with this state fiscal stimulus, this central bank stimulus. There's loads of stories on this graph. The top graph, fossil fuel companies, the blue bit there is their actual contribution to the UK gross value added, if you like, or towards GDP. The pink is how much they're feeding at the trough of quantitative easing money. We know that fossil fuel companies are right in the middle of all this QE money, taking almost free public money, if you like, and using it to invest in fossil fuels in the middle of the COVID crisis. All these stories about don't get a car to work, get a bus, work from home, it'll help. Meanwhile, fossil fuel companies are taking state central bank money to speculate on fossil fuel markets. Pre-COVID, so we don't have the figures for what's happening at the moment, but to show you what kind of the results that will be coming out after this, the amount the oil and gas industry is set to spend in the next 10 years on exploration and extraction it's basically 5 trillion. So that will increase that figure. So this idea that we're kind of working towards some sort of promotion of alternatives to fossil fuels is a nonsense. The companies involved in fossil fuel extraction and burning are investing all of their money, including this quantitative easing money, in fossil fuel extraction. Since the Paris Agreement, 33 global banks, half of which are on the verge of collapse, have provided 2 trillion to fossil fuel companies. And what are they planning for? What are BP and Shell planning for? A report was leaked last year. And currently they're planning, their economic planning, they're getting into rooms to tell their shareholders, lads, lasses, we're planning for a 5% global warming, which is the end of human civilization, in case you didn't know. That's what fossil fuels companies are doing, and we're helping to fund it. When I say we, I mean the state, the British government is helping to fund that. So that's the problem with the fiscal stimulus. So Sean was going to tell you that this is far removed from state socialism. This is not Keynesianism. This is propping up the capitalist system from collapse. Sean, do you want to carry on with that one, mate?
Everyone want to come in, or?
Just carry on, sure. We're running out of time, aren't we?
Carry on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I'll just carry on. So Stevie's covered the stock market, the financial sector. Just to add to what Stevie says, I think the recent estimates are 500 billion of stimulus worldwide as a response to the COVID pandemic has gone to fossil fuel companies. 500 billion alone in the last few months. So like it's not slowing down. And like we said, I saw that someone had put in a comment there around the lack of conditions attached to the government bailouts and QE, and that's right. Like that's across the board. There are no conditions attached. Whether you're dealing with airlines, whether you're dealing with airlines who are sacking thousands of workers, or you're dealing with fossil fuel companies who are killing the planet, there are no conditions attached. But back to the real economy. So we said that the COVID has sort of what it's done is it's sort of concealed a pre-existing crash, a pre-existing crisis, and it's spurred the blushes of capital in many senses, because it's not as easy to point to, but at the same time it's tipped the global economy over the edge, and it's ensured that its severity is much worse than anyone could have imagined. So we know that the UK has been hit badly, Spain has been hit badly, Portugal, India, Italy. These are countries with weak state capacities. They're countries that are heavily dependent on heavily dependent on sort of consumer spending, and there are countries that have implemented very slow lockdowns. That's an interesting thing that's emerging. The number of cases and fatalities linked to the economic picture. Across Europe in particular, the countries that are already were already in trouble are now really, really struggling. Spain, Italy, Portugal, and Greece, and so on. So it's been much worse than anyone could anticipate it. And the so-called V-shaped recovery that a lot of people talk about simply isn't on the cards. It's not happening. All of Europe's major economies are flatlining. The UK is included. In fact, the UK is doing a lot worse than its peers. And this is massive. Like, half of the jobs that were created in the Eurozone since the last crisis have already been lost. They're gone. That's not people furloughed. That's jobs lost. So you think of the scale of the crisis that's emerging. The impact on the southern periphery is bound to be fucking devastating. We've yet to see the impact on the global south, but if you look at India, for example, you can tell that it's going to be pretty severe. Many countries are facing like a doubling of employment if and when their furlough scheme comes to an end. Obviously, the UK, the furlough schemes come to an end very quickly, and we're going to see a massive jobs crisis. Other countries are to follow whenever their furlough scheme or job retention schemes end. And all of the same countries are facing a massive evictions crisis, and these are all government choices. This is a result of pre-existing policy choices, pre-existing government agendas, and the result of the choices that have been made by the government with the resources at its disposal. And as Stevie's outlined, like, the government has massive, if not unlimited, resources at its disposal, and it's chosen not to stave off an evictions crisis. So it's chosen not to provide guarantees for people who are facing unemployment. These are the choices that have been made. And I thought I'd just finish with this, because this is recent. This is as recent as we get. This is the Financial Times this morning. And this sort of indicates what the government is thinking. Some people are asking about bank bailouts and what the government's going to do next. So the Bank of England and the government combined have poured about 300 billion into the financial sector, and into propping up the stock market through the mechanisms that Stevie's outlined. And one of the things the government did at the same time was to agree to guarantee 53 billion in loans for struggling businesses, and that's mainly SMEs. That's business who are actually producing, making, selling things, employing people, actually contributing something to society. 30 billion of these 53 billion loans are at risk of default in the next 6 months or so. And when you work that out, that's 800,000 businesses employing millions of people. So it's not just the furlough scheme, the end of the furlough scheme, that poses a threat. It's how the government uses its monetary and fiscal stimulus in relation to businesses and banks, and how the real economy is treated in a much different way from the financial sector. What the government could do is just wipe this debt. We've pumped 300 billion into the financial sector and the stock market. Surely we could just wipe the debt of 30 odd billion, take a stake in the company, nationalize the company, provide, hold on to that company until conditions improve, then relaunch them, and provide employment for people. But I think this current crop of Tories are particularly sociopathic. They don't really seem to give a shit about the real economy. they're totally focused on propping up the financial sector and the stock market. And I think the sense that I'm getting is that the British government are saying, we've done enough for the real economy. We wouldn't want to go any further because it might start to look like state socialism. It might start to look like actual, state intervention in ownership and, and that sort of thing. Like, so I think, they're indicating that they're going to potentially let these companies go to the wall, or to fight it out with the banks. And, my money would be on the banks.
Yeah, that is important to, if you leave this tonight with any figures, remember that one, 300 billion for the stock market, 50 billion for actual firms that employ actual people in actual communities around Britain. That's the focus of the Tory government. Why? You can argue that the finance capital Tories beat out the industrial Tories. I mean, that was one of the crises during Brexit, was a crisis of the ruling class, between those who kind of, the old patrician Tories that believed in industrial capacity and production versus the kind of free marketeers. And it's the free marketeers and the more sociopathic types that have taken over the Tory party. And that's found its way into government policy. It is far from state socialism when you consider 300 billion going into speculation and 50 billion going into businesses that employ people in our communities. That's really the big difference. We've nearly come to an end of the presentation. I'll just leave you with a couple of quotes. Monthly Review a while ago had a brilliant article in it about the fact that we're heading into kind of an epochal crisis, that what we're facing in the next 50 to 60 years isn't just another recession or depression in capitalism. This is a kind of thing that's going to change the structure of the entire planet. And a crisis of an entire historical epoch is what we're looking into, particularly with climate breakdown. Ecologically, economic and social in its manifestations, stretching from recurrent famine to Black Death and exhaustion to peasant revolts. He's describing the transition from feudalism to capitalism. And many are suggesting now, and many of the modern economists are suggesting we're going to be going through a similar transition over the next 100 years. The question is what kind of transition are we going to see? And if we can quote Rosa Luxemburg, it's that old adage, isn't it, of socialism or barbarism? That's really kind of where we are in a crossroads. And to finish on two quotes to kind of bring that to the fore, this is a headline from the Financial Times. Always read the Financial Times. As Sean said, always read the Economist. They tell us what they're about to do. I mean, they're not hiding any of this stuff, And that's the headline. Let that headline sink in. Has Western-style democracy become too expensive for capitalism? I mean, that's a headline in a mainstream paper. I think it was summer 2018 we got that one. The central reason why Western democracy is in decline is that its capitalist bedfellow can no longer afford the financial demands that full-blown democracy is placing upon it. History has shown that capitalism can adapt. It's nice. Consorting with a variety of political systems, apparently, in the past 5,000 years. Well, David Graeber would fucking turn in his grave if he saw that phrase there, a 300-year-old system pretending it's 5,000 years old. But the last phrase, looking ahead, capitalism will probably find another host. And we know the quote, famous Russian, that, fascism is capitalism in decline. So we're at that crossroads. And our children will certainly see that crossroads emerging between socialism and barbarism. But to leave on a bit of hope, I'm going to leave you with our favourite quote from an American economist, David Schweikart. He said, we will witness another sustained challenge to this most peculiar economic order. The challenge may not succeed. The forces ranged against it are immense. But it is becoming ever clearer that because getting beyond capitalism is the best hope for our species, that attempt will be made. We'll leave it there. Thanks, Gormaigi. I'll stop that share now, Deborah.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. Some really, really good comments in the chat. I think some people got lost at some point. There's so much information, but hopefully everyone learned a lot, and we'll give you a virtual clap. I know you don't like doing this online, so hopefully we can have you at TWT physically next year. We've got 15-20 minutes left because we want everyone to also go and enjoy their Friday night. Sorry, not that this is not enjoyable. And there were a few questions that I sort of picked up on that I thought were really interesting and that maybe everyone might be interested in hearing an answer to. I want to give those people a chance to ask their question rather than you just listening to me. But you don't have to. If I now put the spotlight on you and you don't want to ask it, that's fine as well. The first one was Carmen was asking quite a lot of stuff around growth and sustainability. I was wondering, Carmen, whether you might be interested in making your point and asking your question. And I hope this works, and Charlie unmutes you.
Yes, I think I am on mute. Basically, I think that we need to stop thinking that an economy to work has to grow. And I think we should focus on sustainability, because why do we need 20 pair of shoes? What do we need 20 pair of trousers? Why do we need, we are working 40, 50 hours a week to buy things that we don't need. And if I think of what we need, that is food, that is materials to build houses, to build roads, it's probably only 10% of people that are engaged in those jobs. And those jobs that we need is what I will term as human services: teachers, nurses, physiotherapists, doctors that are providing services that will enhance our quality of life. And we don't need to work 40 hours or 50 hours a week. We are just working those hours to keep capitalists in profit. Personally, I don't care if the stock market collapses. I don't have shares. What do I care? What I want is for workers to keep their jobs. And in order to keep their jobs, we need jobs that, serve our needs. Good teachers, good doctors, good nurses. We need food on the supermarket. We need, a roof over our head. And, if people work 25 hours a week, better. We have more time with our children. We have more time to go to the cinema, to the theater. I don't want to work 40 hours to keep somebody in profit. Since 2008 to now, the 1%, the money that they have accumulated have been exponential, and that is our surplus. Going back to Marx's theory, that is surplus that have extractors pronounced the workers. So perhaps we should go back to the beginning. That's my question. Shouldn't we back to the beginning and stop the growth nonsense?
Fair question. Thank you, Carmen. I'll collect a few questions before I go back to you, Steve and Sean. Zoe, would you be interested in asking your question, which I thought was very simple? And yeah, I would also like to know the answer to that.
Thank you. Yeah, my question was, is any country anywhere in the world, I couldn't see it, doing what you were saying about basically nationalising companies or, taking stakes in companies?
Thanks, Zoe. Sean and Stevie, do you want to get back on those two?
Do you want to do those, Sean? Do the growth one anyway.
Yeah. Well, there's not much to say other than we agree. We'll have a section on GDP growth and how fucking useless it is in the presentation, but we took it out because we didn't think we'd have time. But look, I totally agree with your analysis and your perspective, and that we do need to find a different way of not only understanding but organising the economy. I mean, that's the objective of all of us here. The unfortunate thing, and I suppose the point we're trying to make, that a lot of people are convinced that GDP does matter and that the performance of the stock market does matter. And I suppose part of our job is starting to deconstruct that narrative. And one of the ways I would argue to do that is you deconstruct it on capital's own terms. So you say, well, what are your terms? This system isn't even working according to, on your terms. That's the starting point. That's the start we proceed from. So in order to deconstruct that narrative, you have to point out that it doesn't work.
Stevie, do you want to add anything, or?
Is he muted, is he? No, in terms of the other question there from Zoe about whether other countries are using this crisis as a means to perhaps shift the balance of ownership in the economy. As far as I'm aware, no. I mean, I know there are great proposals coming out from Momentum's and Labour's partners, a Democracy Collaborative in America, which is a really good kind of NGO, a think-do tank. They've presented papers to the Amsterdam, to the Dutch, to the Welsh, to the Scots. So I'm not sure there's one going to England. There's one coming to Northern Ireland about how COVID should be used as a means to precisely do that, to step into the market. Sean mentioned it, to preserve some companies, and then on condition, give those companies strict conditionality for workers on the boards, to relaunch them as worker cooperatives, with conditions that they should transfer away from using fossil fuels perhaps to renewables as part of that buyout package or a part of that support package. Really good ideas, even for a capitalist economy. I mean, this is the thing this is a good idea even for a kind of fossil-free capitalist economy. They're not doing it because that kind of neoliberal groupthink is just embedded in so many places. You know, the very fact that I made the point when we started that even in the Labour movement, even in your own party, if you're a Labour Party member, those ideas are fundamental to how people think about the economy, and they can't think out. It's kind of this mad groupthink that exists everywhere, and we've stopped thinking like socialists do. A socialist, so we would say exactly what you're saying. Why don't we buy out some of these companies, take a stake in some of these companies, get workers on the board, relaunch them as green companies with sustainable futures? That makes sense. Even in a green capitalist economy, they're not even doing that. So no, it doesn't look good. And as far as if someone has examples, I'd love to hear of them, but I don't know of any. You, Sean?
Yeah. Well, just to say that particular proposal or that idea is based on the actual experience of America post Second World War. There was I can't remember the name of it, Finance Reconstruction Corporation or something that was established, and it did precisely that. It bought up stakes in companies that were struggling and relaunched them. And what you would do in this situation is you would buy stakes in larger enterprises that are struggling on strict conditions, that they align their behaviours with a zero carbon pathway. You would buy up SMEs that are viable but otherwise struggling due to this particular situation, and relaunch them as green worker and community owned co-ops. So that's, and one of the reasons why the government isn't taking equity stakes is buying bonds and providing loan guarantees rather than taking equity stakes in companies, is that it wants to benefit the financial sector and the banks. That works to the benefit of the financial sector and the banks. And it would look too much like socialism to actually take stakes in companies.
I mean, when they took stakes in Lloyds Bank in 2008, they couldn't wait to get rid of them, if you remember. I mean, basically, we bought out Lloyds, and one of the biggest banks, one of the oldest banks in the world. They couldn't wait to get rid of the shares and sell them back into the market. It's fundamentally just against their ideological beliefs that it's that obsession with private ownership, and private property.
Carmen just posted this in the chat, and I was just thinking about this, that Spain sort of temporarily nationalised private hospitals. Then I have this vague memory, but correct me if I'm wrong, that actually there's a part in the UK and somewhere in England where the railway was sort of renationalised. Is that a thing, or have I just made that up?
I think the Tories have stepped in a number of occasions and bailed out the railways for the last 3 or 4 years because the privatisation has been such a disaster. They've done it on the QT. They haven't advertised it. If they can get rid of it again and back into private ownership, it's the first thing they'll do. Sean said that the Tories are responding to a crisis, but as free marketeers, whatever they do, the end result will be back into private property and away from the state. One of the myths of neoliberalism was this myth of the small state. So the Tories want to shrink the size of the state. They don't. They want to transfer the responsibility of the state so the state doesn't do anything for the people, it does it for the markets. The state's actually bigger than it was under New Labour in terms of, relative to the size of its GDP. The issue is shifting the state's focus away from labour to capital. That's the job of the state now. The job of the state is simply to support capital, and particularly finance capital, as opposed to productive industrial capital.
Just to address the Spanish experience, and it happened in Ireland as well. What actually happened was they requisitioned the hospitals, which was different from taking them over or nationalising them. So they requisitioned them and they paid the private operators a handsome fee to rent those hospitals for a set period of time. They didn't actually take them over. They're back in the private hands once they weren't needed anymore. And the private operators made a massive amount on top of what they would have ordinarily earned.
I've been corrected many times in the chat as well, so thanks guys, that is helpful. I'm going to do one more round of questions and sort of move the topic of conversation on a little bit. I want to first go to Rachel, who asked a question quite a while ago in the chat. Charlie, could you unmute Rachel, if she's still there? No?
Yeah,
Well,
it's unmuted. Do you want to speak, Rachel?
Sorry, my internet connection went really bad. Could you just repeat what you'd asked me to say?
yeah, basically you just posted quite an interesting question in the chat, and I was just wondering whether you wanted to come in, comment, ask your question.
Thank you. Which question was that? I think I asked a couple.
We're trying this out for the first time. You were asking about, I mean, I'll just ask it for you. What we can do in practical terms, and basically like what we should be demanding now. But I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, it's just really, really helpful.
I think that's the question asked, Debs.
Fair enough. Thank you, Rachel. And then Gaia, are you still with us? You asked a question ages ago that a few people said they wanted to hear the answer to.
Hi there. Yeah, I actually asked a very similar question to Rachel. So yeah, it was just about what demands we should be making. And I think some of the reflections from Stephen and Sean are kind of touching on that. I mean, you're talking about the kind of proposals that have been put forward to the Dutch and the Scot and the Welsh and these ideas, and those are sort of like happening a little bit, not behind the scenes, but maybe activists on the ground don't know about it. Are these the kinds of things that, like, what are the sort of like elements of demands that we should be making? You also mentioned, you know, this idea that the GDP idea, like, it was like a false benchmark. What kind of benchmark should we be promoting and demanding that the economy be measured against, and how can we bring this into, I guess, into activist terminology and practice?
Yeah, one of the tragedies of this period is that the answers are there. I mean, there are really good people working on really good policies and really good ideas that can work, that do work. I mean, some of the policies and ideas are based on kind of that idea of building utopias now and building the future now. There are pockets of really interesting alternative economics, alternative economies emerging, really good ideas. I mean, the Commonwealth in Scotland, Commonwealth, Neon, all these great organisations in Britain who do great policy work. The problem is, we had this debate with Deborah the other day, the problem is too many of those ideas stay in those institutions and don't get out into communities. And that's that gap, that's that disconnect between political economy, alternative economics, and the communities that we come from, is that no one's going out and talking about these issues. The other issue is that even if you have, as you did, if you're a Labour Party member, a really decent manifesto with loads of really good ideas that seemed to be opening a door to a different kind of sustainable future, you have to win power. You know, there's no point making demands of the Tories. Fuck them. They're not going to give us anything. I mean, the particular crop of Tories that exist in that are the most radical free marketeers, the Keynesian, they're the kind of Hayekian Tories, if you like. They're way beyond where even Thatcher dared to go. They're not going to give us anything. They have to be, well, you have to put them out of power. That's the reality. Now, the question then, of course, is how do you build power? And I'll go back to the first point we made. Part of that is political education in communities and winning people over to thinking differently about the world they live in. And that's not easy. That's long, hard, slog work. And that doesn't happen within electoral cycles either, by the way.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on how you guys do that work in Northern Ireland, or how you try and do that work?
We were lucky that we had a vehicle of the Right to Water campaign, in the sense that there were enough angry people around the country that we just literally had to pick up a phone and say, look, we're going to come down there and give a session on political economy about why water utilities should be publicly owned and not privatised. And we would walk into a pub and there'd be 100 people packed into it. And we'd set up a PowerPoint, and like we've done here tonight, we'd sit and talk to them and convince them. And we recruited then from that group of 100, maybe like 10 of the leaders, organic leaders, work people in that village or that community, and we invited them up to Dublin for a 3-day intensive political course on political economy and socialist ideas, and then sent them back into those communities. And we had the ability to do that again and again and again and again. And that's what we need to do.
Just to add that, I suppose you start from start from the issue that people are concerned with. What is affecting their everyday lives? So if it's water privatizations, the closure of a GP surgery, it's housing, it's the environment. We're working with a group in Tyrone here in the north of Ireland who are campaigning against the gold mine in their community. And so the obvious point is to start from there. You don't start with the big picture. Start with the concerns that matter to them. Start with the things that are affecting them directly in the here and the now. And then you integrate that into systemic analysis. You integrate that into the bigger picture. Now, how does that fit into the bigger picture? How does that fit into a national, European, international agenda? And then what you have is you have a critique of capitalism, but you're proceeding from the reality on the ground. And I suppose that's the point, is to be engaging with communities that are campaigning. There's countless campaigns ongoing across Britain and Ireland. Now it's not to say we can do all of that work, but we can make a stab of getting in and doing some of it.
I want to take two last questions. We'll do them really quickly. The first one, Lorcan, do you want to come in? I've seen you make quite a few points and ask questions.
Yeah, I was wondering, how committed is your union leadership to funding this kind of work, and other unions and stuff? I mean, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of it about, and I don't see much of it in my union. So yeah, that's my question.
I just answered you on the chat there, Lorcan. I just saw it come up, but I'll give it to everyone else as well. Our Unite's better than most, but that's maybe biased because we're in it and we have more experience of it. But Unite brought us over to Durham Unite Political School in 2016, and we were there every year since. And from that, we've been working in nearly all the regions of England, bits of Scotland, working with Unite political officers and education officers, and delivering 3 or 4 or 5 day even political education, political economy courses, not for their officials who need it, by the way, just to throw that point in, but for their members and their key reps. So Unite have been really good, and Danny Freeman, particularly in London, who's the education officer in kind of, I think, London South East region Unite, he's had us over, I don't know, a dozen times in the last 2 or 3 years working with reps, in Ruskin College down in London, and other political officers. So they're really good. I don't know enough about the other British-based unions to say what they're doing in this regard. From my experience, not very much. I hope someone corrects me, but from what I can find, not very much.
Just to be fair, I think the CWU and RM team seem to be serious about political education, as far as I can tell. But from my experience of dealing with them, in Ireland, it's non-existent. There's a handful of people doing political education, the union movement in Ireland, and doing serious political education. So it is a bit of a struggle. Although it was heartening to see, from our union's perspective, Len McCluskey has made positive noises in the last year. I haven't seen Howard Beckett has made a big play for, on the need for political education, on the need for left media and so on. So it'd be interesting to see whether, they come through with some support for that. But as Stevie says, we have got support from officials within Unite for that type of work, to be fair to them.
One of the biggest problems, Lorcan, was that years ago, decades now, the union kind of went into an agreement, with Mephistopheles, an agreement with the government to pay for union education, and that set up all these colleges all around Britain that were trade union centres. Some of them did really good work, but slowly over time they became almost like FEs. It was about skills-based learning. It was about pre-distribution, making yourself more sellable in the market. And it just drifted out, this idea of building a collective working class militant movement, which is really what we need. But that seemed to become something that just didn't exist. And in terms of economics and political economy, it was almost absent. And I'm not sure that's back yet. I mean, if you joined the union movement 40 years ago, your first class would have been on political economy. How does the world work? Where's my position in it? What are my material interests? That just doesn't exist in the places it should do anymore. And again, I'll repeat the point I made earlier, that's part of the kind of colonization of institutions throughout Europe by those neoliberal ideas, which we have to first deconstruct before we can even reconstruct socialist ones. It's like a double challenge nearly.
Quite a few people in the chat said that it was a lot to take in and they really want to do follow-up reading or go to a course or listen.
Yeah, I'll put into the chat there, Deborah. I'll put in a link to our, we do Trademark Belfast podcast, and on a lot of them podcasts, there are quite detailed bibliographies as well. Like if you click onto the edit, there's dozens and dozens of books and articles on websites, and they're good introductory stuff as well, you know, for people who might want to just kind of grapple with what a collateralized debt obligation is, or what the gilt market is, or what the bond market is, and why it's important to people. So if you go into our podcast and listen to the podcast, obviously, but there's great bibliography. There's good bibliographies on it as well.
Amazing. Okay, so that's good follow up. And I think there are some other sessions in the program. I think there is a sort of capitalism 101 course with Jeremy Gilbert as well that still has 3 sessions to go. So that might be a good sort of next step. I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank Stevie and Sean. Thanks so much for joining us. It was super, super interesting. And credit to you that so many people joined on a Friday night. Just to say just a few really quick announcements. Please do check out the forum, the community forum, which has been set up just for the festival. And basically it's a place to have discussions with other festival attendees and sort of get that feeling of like being together and networking and linking up and meeting new people. Also remember there are loads of other events at TWT 20. We've literally only just got started. So go on the website, make sure you're registered. A lot of them sort of filling up very, very fast. And finally, our plea, if you enjoyed the session and would like to help us sustain our work, please, please, please consider supporting us at theworldtransformed.org/support.
View the full TWT 20 program and become a supporter today to help us deliver political education all year round at theworldtransformed.org.